All right, let's see if we can get away with another one. Live from the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, California. Chapter 2. 1 second before. Various muscles have moved, and a behavior has happened. Perhaps it is a good act. You've empathetically touched the arm of a suffering person. Perhaps it is a foul act. You've pulled a trigger, targeting an innocent person. Perhaps it is a good act. You've pulled a trigger, drawing fire to save others. Perhaps it is a foul act. You touch the arm of someone, starting a chain of libidinal events that betray a loved one. Acts that, as emphasized, are definable only by context. Thus, to ask the question that will begin this and the next 8 chapters, why did this behavior occur? As this book's starting point, we know that different disciplines produce different answers, because of some hormone, because of evolution, because of childhood experiences, or genes, or culture. And as the book's central premise, these are utterly intertwined answers, none standing alone. But on the most proximal level, in this chapter we ask, what happened 1 second before the behavior that caused it to occur? This puts us in the realm of neurobiology, of understanding the brain that commanded those muscles. This chapter is one of the book's anchors. The brain is the final common pathway, the conduit that mediates the influences of all the distal factors to be covered in the chapters to come. What happened an hour, a decade, a million years earlier? What happened were factors that impacted the brain and the behavior it produced. This chapter has 2 major challenges. The first is its god-awful length. Apologies, I've tried to be succinct and non-technical, but this is foundational material that needs to be covered. Second, regardless of how non-technical I've tried to be, the material can overwhelm someone with no background in neuroscience. To help with that, please wade through Appendix 1 around now. Can't win them all. Now we ask, what crucial things happened in the second before that pro or antisocial behavior occurred? Or translated into neurobiology, what was going on with action potentials, neurotransmitters, and neural circuits in particular brain regions during that second? 3 metaphorical but not literal layers. We start by considering the brain's macroorganization using a model proposed in the 1960s by the neuroscientist Paul MacLean. His triune brain model conceptualizes the brain as having 3 functional domains. Layer 1, an ancient part of the brain, at its base, found in species from humans to geckos. This layer mediates automatic regulatory functions. If body temperature drops, this brain region senses it and commands muscles to shiver. If blood glucose levels plummet, that's sensed here, generating hunger. If an injury occurs, a different loop initiates a stress response. Layer 2, a more recently evolved region that has expanded in mammals. MacLean conceptualized this layer as being about emotions, somewhat of a mammalian invention. If you see something gruesome and terrifying, this layer sends commands down to ancient layer 1, making you shiver with emotion. If you're feeling sadly unloved, regions here prompt layer 1 to generate a craving for comfort food. If you're a rodent and smell a cat, neurons here cause layer 1 to initiate a stress response. Layer 3, the recently evolved layer of neurocortex sitting on the upper surface of the brain. Proportionately, primates devote more of their brain to this layer than do other species. Cognition, memory storage, sensory processing, abstractions, philosophy, naval contemplation. Read a scary passage of a book, and layer 3 signals layer 2 to make you feel frightened, prompting layer 1 to initiate shivering. See an ad for Oreos and feel a craving. Layer 3 influences layers 2 and 1. Contemplate the fact that loved ones won't live forever, or kids in refugee camps, or how the Navi's home tree was destroyed by those jerk humans in Avatar, despite the fact that, wait, Navi aren't real. And layer 3 pulls layers 2 and 1 into the picture, and you feel sad and have the same sort of stress response that you'd have if you were fleeing a lion. Thus, we've got the brain divided into three functional buckets, with the usual advantages and disadvantages of categorization, a continuum. The biggest disadvantage is how simplistic this is. For example, anatomically, there is a considerable overlap among the three layers. For example, one part of the cortex can be best thought of as a part of layer 2. Stay tuned. B, the flow of information and commands is not just top-down, from layer 3 to 2 to 1. A weird, great example explored in chapter 15. If someone is holding a cold drink, temperature is processed in layer 1, they are more likely to judge someone they meet as having a cold personality, layer 3. C, automatic aspects of behavior, simplistically the purview of layer 1, emotion, layer 2, and thought, layer 3, are not separable. D, the triune model leads one erroneously to think that evolution in effect slapped on each new layer without any changes occurring in the ones already there. Despite these drawbacks, which MacLean himself emphasized, this model will be a good organizing metaphor for us. The limbic system. To make sense of our best and worst behaviors, automaticity, emotion, and cognition must all be considered. I arbitrarily start with layer 2 and its emphasis on emotion. Early 20th century neuroscientists thought it obvious what layer 2 did. Take your standard issue lab animal, a rat, and examine its brain. Right at the front would be these two gigantic lobes, the olfactory bulbs, one for each nostril, the primary receptive area for odors. What's up, Jill? Good to see you. I think I have been born again. Maybe living another life. Neuroscientists at the time asked what parts of the brain these gigantic rodent olfactory bulbs talked to. In other words, where they sent their axonal projections. Which brain regions were only a single synapse away from receiving olfactory information. Which were two synapses, three, and so on. And it was layer 2 structures that received the first communiques. Everyone concluded. This part of the brain must process odors, and so it was termed the rhinencephalon, the nose brain. What's up, Dr. Mordecai Cassius Marcellus Jones? Good to see you. Meanwhile, in the 30s and 40s, neuroscientists such as the young MacLean, James Papez, Paul Busey, and Heinrich Kluver were starting to figure out what the layer 2 structures did. For example, if you lesion or destroy layer 2 structures, this produces Kluver-Bucy syndrome, featuring abnormalities in sociality, especially in sexual and aggressive behaviors. They concluded that these structures, soon termed the limbic system for obscure reasons, were about emotion. Rhinencephalon or limbic system, olfaction or emotion. Pitched street battles ensued until someone pointed out the obvious. For a rat, emotion and olfaction are nearly synonymous, since nearly all the environmental stimuli that elicit emotions in a rodent are olfactory. Peace in our time. In a rodent, olfactory inputs are what the limbic system most depends on for emotional news of the world. In contrast, the primate limbic system is more informed by visual inputs. Limbic function is now recognized as central to the emotions that fuel our best and worst behaviors, and extensive research has uncovered the functions of its structures. In other words, the amygdala, hippocampus, septum, habenula, and mammillary bodies. Oh shit, that's it, for example. my bad. There really aren't centers in the brain for particular behaviors. This is particularly the case with the limbic system and emotion. There is indeed a subregion of the motor cortex that approximates being the center for making your left pinky bend. Other regions have center-ish roles in regulating breathing or body temperature, but there sure aren't centers for feeling pissy or horny, for feeling bittersweet nostalgia or warm protectiveness tinged with contempt, or for that, what is that thing called love feeling? No surprise. Then the circuitry connecting various limbic structures is immensely complex. The autonomic nervous system and the ancient core regions of the brain. The limbic system's regions form complex circuits of excitation and inhibition. It's easier to understand this by appreciating the deeply held desire of every limbic structure to influence what the hypothalamus does. Why? Because of its importance. The hypothalamus, a limbic structure, is the interface between layers 1 and 2, between core regulatory and emotional parts of the brain. Consistent with that, the hypothalamus gets massive inputs from limbic layer 2 structures, but disproportionately sends projections to layer 1 regions. These are the evolutionarily ancient midbrain and brain stem, which regulate automatic reactions throughout the body. For a reptile, such automatic regulation is straightforward. If muscles are working hard, this is sensed by neurons throughout the body that send signals up the spine to layer 1 regions, resulting in signals back down the spine that increase heart rate and blood pressure. The result is more oxygen and glucose for the muscles. Oh dear. There's deer walking by. I should film them. They're gone. Gorge on food and stomach walls distend. Neurons embedded there sense this and pass on the news, and soon blood vessels in the gut dilate, increasing blood flow and facilitating digestion. Too warm? Blood is sent to the body's surface to dissipate heat. All of this is automatic or autonomic, and thus the midbrain and brainstem regions, along with their projections down the spine and out to the body, are collectively termed the autonomic nervous system. Apologies, I have to periodically look out for trucks here. It is also often called the involuntary nervous system, contrasting it with the voluntary nervous system. The latter is about conscious, voluntary movement and involves neurons in motor regions of the brain and their projections down the spine to skeletal muscles. And where does the hypothalamus come in? It's the means by which the limbic system influences autonomic function, how layer 2 talks to layer 1. Have a full bladder with its muscle walls distended, and midbrain, brainstem circuitry votes for urinating. Be exposed to something sufficiently terrifying, and limbic structures via the hypothalamus persuade the midbrain and brainstem to do the same. This is how emotions change bodily functions, why limbic roads eventually lead to the hypothalamus. Just as a warning of complexities to come, the hypothalamus consists of a bunch of different nuclei, each receiving a unique orchestration of limbic inputs and equivalently distinctive outputs to various midbrain brainstem regions. And while each hypothalamic nucleus has a different set of functions, they all fall under the general rubric of autonomic regulation. The autonomic nervous system has two parts, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, with fairly opposite functions. The sympathetic nervous system, SNS, mediates the body's response to arousing circumstances, for example, producing the famed fight or flight stress response. Oh, see you later, Dr. Mordecai Cassius Marcellus Jones. Thanks for coming by. To use the feeble joke told to first-year medical students, the SNS mediates the 4 Fs: fear, fight, flight, and sex. Particular midbrain brainstem nuclei sending long SNS projections down the spine and onto outposts throughout the body, where the axon terminals release the neurotransmitter neuroepinephrine. There's one exception that makes the SNS more familiar. In the adrenal gland, instead of neuroepinephrine, aka noradrenaline, being released, it is epinephrine, aka the famous adrenaline. And to needlessly complicate things further, thus explaining why this is buried in a footnote, there is actually an intervening synapse between the long spinal projection neurons of the SNS and the SNS neurons reaching targeted cells. This is the second neuron in the two-step pathway that releases neuroepinephrine. The first neuron in each pathway releases acetylcholine. Give me a second. Meanwhile, the parasympathetic nervous system, or PNS, arises from different midbrain brainstem nuclei that project down the spine to the body. In contrast, the SNS and the four Fs, the PNS is about calm, vegetative states. The SNS speeds up the heart. The PNS slows it down. The PNS promotes digestion. The SNS inhibits it, which makes sense if you're running for your life, avoiding being someone's lunch. Don't waste energy digesting breakfast. A nice logical piece of this: suppose you're stressed, not by running for your life from a lion, but by having to give a speech. Your mouth gets dry. The first step of your SNS shutting down digestion until a more auspicious time. And as we will see in chapter 14, if seeing someone in pain activates your SNS, you're likely to be preoccupied with your own distress instead of helping. Turn on the PNS and it's the opposite. Given that the SNS and PNS do opposite things, the PNS is obviously going to be releasing a different neurotransmitter from its axon terminals, acetylcholine. Like the SNS, the PNS gets the brain to target organs via two steps. And as one complication, the SNS and PNS branches aren't always working in complete opposition. In some cases, they function in a more cooperative, sequential manner. For example, erection and ejaculation involve coordination between the SNS and PNS that is so complicated that it's a miracle that any of us were conceived. There is a second, equally important way in which emotion influences the body. Specifically, the hypothalamus also regulates the release of many hormones. This is covered in chapter 4. So the limbic system indirectly regulates autonomic function and hormone release. What does this have to do with behavior? Plenty, because the autonomic and hormonal states of the body feed back to the brain, influencing behavior, typically unconsciously. In other words, layers 2 and 3 can influence the autonomic functions of layer 1, which alters events throughout the body, which in turn influences all parts of the brain, loops and loops. Appears business is beginning to pick up here. There is a second, equally important way in which emotion influences the body. Specifically, the hypothalamus also regulates the release of many hormones. This is covered in chapter 4. Oh, I already read that. My bad. Stay tuned for more in chapters 3 and 4. The interface between the limbic system and the cortex. Time to add the cortex. As noted, this is the brain's upper surface. Its name comes from the Latin cortic, meaning tree bark, and is the newest part of the brain. The cortex is the gleaming, logical, analytical crown jewel of layer 3. Most sensory information flows there to be decoded. It's where muscles are commanded to move, where language is comprehended and produced, where memories are stored, where spatial and mathematical skills reside, where executive decisions are made. It floats above the limbic system, supporting philosophers since at least Descartes, who have emphasized the dichotomy between thought and emotion. Of course, that's all wrong, as shown by the temperature of a cup, something processed in the hypothalamus, altering assessment of the coldness of someone's personality. Emotions filter the nature and accuracy of what is remembered. Stroke damage to certain cortical regions blocks the ability to speak. Some sufferers reroute the cerebral world of speech through emotive limbic detours. They can sing what they want to say. The cortex and limbic system are not separate, as scads of axonal projections course between the two. Crucially, those projections are bidirectional. The limbic system talks to the cortex, rather than merely being reined in by it. The false dichotomy between thought and feeling is presented in the classic Descartes error by the neurologist Antonio Damasio of the University of Southern California. His work is discussed later. While the hypothalamus dwells at the interface levels, while the hypothalamus dwells at the interface of layers 1 and 2, it is the incredibly interesting frontal cortex that is the interface between layers 2 and 3. Key insight into the frontal cortex was provided in 1960s by a giant of neuroscience, Wal Nata of MIT. Nata was not only a towering scientist, but also a force of integrity, as well as a renowned teacher who made neuroanatomy. Taught in 3-hour evening classes, borderline fun. During college, I did research in the lab next to his, and I was so in awe of the guy that I'd find every possible autonomic excuse to go to the bathroom whenever I saw him heading in that direction, just for the chance to offhandedly say hello to him by the urinals. My awe grew further later when my discovery that he and his family sheltered Jews from Nazis in Holland during World War II and are cited in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Nada studied what brain regions sent axons to the frontal cortex and what regions got axons from it. And the frontal cortex was bidirectionally enmeshed with the limbic system, leading him to propose that the frontal cortex was a quasi-member of the limbic system. Naturally, everyone thought him daft. The frontal cortex was the most recently evolved part of the very highbrow cortex. The only reason why the frontal cortex would ever go slumming into the limbic system would be to preach honest labor and Christian temperance to the urchins there. Naturally, Nada was right. In different circumstances, the frontal cortex and limbic system stimulate or inhibit each other, collaborate and coordinate, or bicker and work at cross purposes. It really is an honorary member of the limbic system, and the interactions between the frontal cortex and other limbic structures are at the core of much of this book. Two more details. First, the cortex is not a smooth surface, but instead is folded into convolutions. Convolutions form a superstructure of 4 separate lobes, the temporal, parietal, occipital, and frontal, with each with different functions. Second, brains obviously have left and right sides or hemispheres that roughly mirror each other. Thus, except for the relatively few midline structures, brain regions come in pairs, a left and right amygdala, hippocampus, temporal lobe, and so on. Functions are often lateralized, such that the left and right hippocampi, for example, have different but related functions. The greatest lateralization occurs in the cortex. The left hemisphere is analytical, the right more involved in intuition and creativity. These contrasts have caught the public fancy, with cortical lateralization exaggerated by many to an absurd extent, where left-brainedness has the connotation of anal retentive bean counting, and right-brainedness is about making mandalas or singing with whales. In fact, the functional difference between the hemispheres is generally subtle, and I'm mostly ignoring lateralization. We're now ready to examine the brain regions most central to this book, namely the amygdala, the frontal cortex, the mesolimbic and mesocortical dopamine system. Discussion of other bit player regions will be subsumed under the headings for these 3. We start with the one arguably most central to our worst behaviors. The amygdala. The amygdala, the word is from the Greek, thank you Wikipedia, which means almond, which the amygdala very vaguely resembles. Weirdly, it turns out that the word also means tonsil, which must have produced some major malpractice suits when ancient Greeks went in for tonsillectomies. The amygdala is the archetypal limbic structure, sitting under the cortex in the temporal lobe. It is central to mediating aggression, along with other behaviors that tell us tons about aggression. At first pass at the amygdala and aggression. The evidence for the amygdala's role in aggression is extensive, based on research approaches that will become familiar. First, there is the correlative recording approach. Stick recording electrodes into numerous species amygdalae. The amygdala is one of those bilateral structures, meaning that there are two of them, one in each hemisphere mirroring each other. And see when the neurons there have action potentials. This turns out to be when the animal is being aggressive. A note about specificity. To be confident the amygdala really is selectively about aggression, you also have to show that it activates more than do other brain regions and doesn't activate as much during the hodgepodge of other behaviors. In a related approach, determine which brain regions consume extra oxygen or glucose or synthesize certain activity-related proteins during aggression. The amygdala tops the list. Moving beyond mere correlation, if you lesion the amygdala in an animal, rates of aggression decline. The same occurs transiently when you temporarily silence the amygdala by injecting Novocaine into it. Conversely, implanting electrodes that stimulate neurons there, or spritzing in excitatory neurotransmitters, stay tuned, triggers aggression. Show human subjects pictures that provoke anger and the amygdala activates, as shown with neuroimaging. Sticking an electrode in someone's amygdala and stimulating it, as is done for certain types of neurosurgery, produces rage. The most convincing data concern rare humans with damage restricted to the amygdala, either due to a type of encephalitis or a congenital disorder called Urbach-Wiethe disease, or where the amygdala was surgically destroyed to control severe drug-resistant seizures originating there. Such individuals are impaired in detecting angry facial expressions, while being fine at recognizing other emotional states. Stay tuned. And what does amygdala damage due to aggressive behavior? This was studied in humans where amygdalotomies were done not to control seizures, but to control aggression. Such psychosurgery provoked fiery controversy in the 1970s, and I don't mean scientists not saying hello. And I don't mean scientists not saying hello to each other at conferences. I mean a major public shitstorm. The issue raised bioethical lightning rods. What counted as pathological aggression? Who decided? What other interventions had been tried unsuccessfully? Were some types of aggressive individuals more likely to go under the knife than others? What constituted a cure? Many of these cases concerned rare epileptics where seizure onset was most associated with uncontrollable aggression, and where the goal was to contain that behavior. These papers had titles such as Clinical clinical and physiological effects of stereotaxic bilateral amygdalotomy for intractable aggression. Looks like I'm going to have to cut this one off here. I know, right? What? What? Um, yeah. Looks like things are picking up around here, so I may have to just continue this later. I'm just reading some Sapolsky, killing time at work, so I figured I'd, put some shit up on the internet. I won't be able to make it to the end of this segment, but yeah, people keep coming in now. It was after 4 a.m. here. Got a little over an hour to go left on this shift. So yeah, we'll come back to it. It's fine. It's fine. I didn't expect to be here this late, but here I am. So, training day. All right. Well, I'll come back later once this thing's done with, and I'll say hi and talk about my grievances. All right. Well, be well and be kind and all of that stuff. And I'll see you soon.